Staff Sergeant Alexandra "Tank" Washington had always believed that serving her country meant something. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan had taught her that honor wasn't just a word they painted on recruiting posters. But standing on Highway 78 outside Cedar Falls, California, watching Chief of Police Vernon Blackwood swagger toward her disabled Honda Civic with the arrogance of a man who'd never heard bullets whistle past his ears, Alex felt that familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same one that had kept her alive through countless firefights overseas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alex had been driving home from her job at the Veterans Assistance Center when her engine started smoking. She'd pulled over immediately, popped the hood, and was assessing the damage when the Cedar Falls Police cruiser rolled up behind her with its lights flashing. Standard procedure, she thought. Officer offers assistance, maybe calls a tow truck, everyone goes home safe. She couldn't have been more wrong. Chief Vernon Blackwood stepped out of the patrol car like he owned the entire stretch of highway. At 52, he carried himself with the bloated confidence of a man who'd spent 28 years terrorizing a small town without consequence. His uniform was pristine, his badge polished to a mirror shine, and his hand rested casually on his service weapon as he approached Alex's car. "License and registration," Blackwood demanded without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries or asking if she needed help. Alex looked up from under the hood, her hands still greasy from checking the engine. "Evening, Chief. Just having some car trouble. Engine overheated, but I think it's just a coolant leak." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance. Alex was 28, 5'6", with the kind of lean muscle that came from years of military training. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite being dressed in civilian clothes, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. More importantly, to Blackwood's prejudiced mind, her last name and appearance marked her as exactly the kind of person he enjoyed intimidating. "I said license and registration," Blackwood repeated, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "You deaf, girl?" Alex felt her jaw tighten at the disrespect, but she kept her voice level. 3 tours overseas had taught her when to pick her battles. "Just getting my wallet, Chief." She wiped her hands on a rag and reached into her purse, producing her driver's license and vehicle registration. Blackwood snatched the documents from her hand and studied them with theatrical intensity, as if memorizing every detail. "Alexandra Washington," he read aloud, his voice dripping with disdain. "Says here you live on Maple Street. That's the Veterans Housing Complex, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Alex replied, wondering where this was heading. "Military?" Blackwood's question sounded more like an accusation. "Army. Staff Sergeant, 3 tours overseas." Alex wasn't sure why she felt compelled to add her service record, but something in Blackwood's tone suggested he viewed her military service as a liability rather than an asset. Blackwood's expression shifted to something approaching disgust. "Another one of you hero types, huh? Think your service gives you special privileges?" He circled her car slowly, like a predator stalking prey. "Tell me, Sergeant Washington, you been drinking tonight?" Alex blinked in surprise. "Drinking? No, sir. I just got off work. Like I said, my car overheated, so I pulled over to—" "Step out of the vehicle," Blackwood ordered, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Chief, I'm not sure what—" "Now." Alex complied, her military training kicking in automatically. She'd learned long ago that escalating situations with authority figures rarely ended well, regardless of who was right. But as she stood beside her smoking Honda, she couldn't shake the feeling that this traffic stop had nothing to do with her car trouble and everything to do with who she was. Blackwood began what could only be described as a harassment disguised as a sobriety test. He made Alex walk an imaginary line, touch her nose with her eyes closed, and recite the alphabet backwards, all while her car continued to leak coolant onto the asphalt. Every movement was captured on his body camera, creating what Alex would later realize was a carefully orchestrated performance. "You seem pretty steady for someone who's been drinking," Blackwood said, sounding almost disappointed, "but I can smell alcohol on your breath." Alex stared at him in disbelief. Chief, I haven't had a drink in 3 days. I don't drink and drive, period. Are you calling me a liar, Sergeant? The way he said her rank made it sound like an insult. Before Alex could respond, a pickup truck slowed as it passed, the driver clearly concerned about the scene unfolding on the roadside. Blackwood immediately turned toward the vehicle, his demeanor shifting to one of barely controlled rage. "Keep moving," he shouted at the Good Samaritan. "Police business." The truck reluctantly accelerated, but not before Alex caught a glimpse of the driver's face, an older Hispanic man who looked like he wanted to help, but didn't dare challenge the chief of police. She would later learn that this was Maria Santos's husband, Carlos, returning home from his shift at the naval base. He would remember this encounter, just as Maria would remember the others that followed. Blackwood returned his attention to Alex, and she could see something calculating in his eyes. This wasn't about drunk driving or car trouble. This was about power, control, and a systematic campaign of intimidation that she was only beginning to understand. "You seem pretty steady for someone who's been drinking," Blackwood said, sounding almost disappointed, "but I can smell alcohol on your breath." "I'll give you a choice, Sergeant Washington," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a mock generous tone. "I can arrest you right now for driving under the influence, or you can accept a citation for reckless driving and call someone to come get you." Alex felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. Neither option was fair. She hadn't been drinking, and she certainly hadn't been driving recklessly. Her car had simply overheated. But she also recognized that Blackwood held all the cards in this situation. In his jurisdiction, his word was law, and challenging him on the side of a dark highway seemed like a recipe for disaster. "I'll take the citation," she said through gritted teeth. Blackwood smiled, and it was the coldest expression Alex had seen since her last firefight in Fallujah. "Smart choice, Sergeant, but let me make something clear. This is my town, and we do things my way here. I don't care what you did overseas. In Cedar Falls, you're just another citizen, and citizens follow the rules." As he wrote the citation, Alex studied his face, memorizing every detail. She'd learned in combat that knowledge of your enemy was the difference between survival and becoming a casualty. Blackwood was clearly an enemy, though she didn't yet understand the scope of the war he was waging against people like her. The citation was for $400, reckless driving in a construction zone, though there was no construction for miles in either direction. When Alex pointed this out, Blackwood just smiled. "Court date's in 3 weeks, he said, handing her the ticket. "Make sure you show up. Wouldn't want to add failure to appear to your record." As Blackwood drove away, Alex called for a tow truck and tried to process what had just happened. She'd been harassed, intimidated, and handed a citation for a crime she hadn't committed, all while trying to deal with the mechanical breakdown. It was her first real taste of Chief Vernon Blackwood's version of justice, but it wouldn't be her last. Standing in the darkness beside Highway 78, watching the taillights of the tow truck disappear into the distance, Alex made a decision that would eventually change everything. She wasn't going to let this slide. She'd fought too hard for her country to let some small-town tyrant treat her like a second-class citizen. But Alex had no idea that Vernon Blackwood had been waging his own war for decades, a systematic campaign against veterans, minorities, and anyone else who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. She was about to become his latest target, and the battle that followed would ultimately require the intervention of 6 Black Hawk helicopters and 200 Marines to resolve. The war for Cedar Falls was about to begin, and Staff Sergeant Alexandra Tank Washington had just fired the first shot by refusing to be intimidated. She just didn't know it yet. Chief Vernon Blackwood had built his empire on fear. And after 28 years of terrorizing Cedar Falls, he had perfected the art of selective enforcement. His office walls were decorated with commendations from local political figures, photos with state legislators, and framed newspaper clippings celebrating his tough-on-crime approach. What those articles didn't mention was Blackwood's particular definition of crime, being poor, being different, or, worst of all,
being a veteran who thought their service meant something. Blackwood had grown up in Cedar Falls when it was still a sleepy agricultural town before Camp Pendleton's expansion brought an influx of military families to the area. He'd watched his childhood neighborhood change, seen new faces and new voices challenge the old order, and he'd made it his life's mission to remind these newcomers exactly who was in charge. His methods were sophisticated for a small-town tyrant. Traffic stops that turned into fishing expeditions, building code violations that materialized overnight, business licenses that got mysteriously delayed, health inspections that found violations no one else could see. Blackwood understood that you didn't need jackboots and midnight raids when you had the power of bureaucracy and a badge. But veterans were his specialty. Something about their bearing, their confidence, their unwillingness to show proper deference triggered a rage in Blackwood that ran deeper than simple prejudice. These men and women came back from overseas thinking they were heroes, thinking their service meant something. Blackwood took personal satisfaction in showing them exactly how little their medals and ribbons meant in his jurisdiction. Officer Danny Kruger knocked on Blackwood's office door 3 days after the incident with Alex Washington. Kruger was 34, a decade younger than his boss, but already showing signs of the moral rot that came from working under Blackwood's command. He'd started as an idealistic young officer who wanted to serve his community. Now he was little more than Blackwood's personal attack dog. "Chief, got the background check on that Washington woman," Kruger said, dropping a thick folder on Blackwood's desk. Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Tell me everything." Kruger opened the file and began reading. Alexandra Washington, age 28, 3 combat tours. Iraq in 2019, Afghanistan twice between 2020 and 2022. Purple Heart recipient after her convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. Currently works at the Cedar Falls Veterans Assistance Center. Helps other vets with benefit claims and job placement. Purple Heart, huh? Blackwood's voice dripped with mock sympathy. One of those wounded warrior types. Probably thinks that makes her untouchable. Gets better, Kruger continued. She's been filing complaints about local business practices. Apparently, she's helping other veterans who've been having trouble with permits, licenses, that sort of thing. She's been asking a lot of questions about why vets seem to face more obstacles than other residents. Blackwood's smile widened. Alexandra Washington wasn't just another target. She was actively working against his system. What else? She's got connections. Former commanding officer is Captain Lisa Morales, now with the National Guard unit at Camp Pendleton. Tight-knit group of Army buddies who all serve together. They've got a group chat, meet up regularly. Some of them are still active duty. This information should have made Blackwood cautious. A smart man would have recognized that targeting someone with military connections could bring unwanted scrutiny. But Vernon Blackwood had spent so many years operating without consequences that the possibility of real opposition never occurred to him. "Perfect," he said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked Main Street. "Time to show Sergeant Washington how things work in my town." Over the next week, Alex's life became a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. Her car inspection, due for renewal, suddenly required additional emissions testing that wasn't available in Cedar Falls. The testing facility in the next county kept finding reasons to reschedule her appointment. Her landlord received an anonymous tip about possible code violations in the veteran housing complex. City inspectors arrived unannounced, armed with clipboards and measuring tapes, finding problems that never existed before. The hot water heater was 6 inches too close to the wall. The fire extinguisher was mounted at the wrong height. Each violation came with a fine and a deadline for correction. Alex's job at the Veterans Assistance Center suddenly faced new scrutiny. The city required updated licensing for nonprofit organizations. Forms that had been routine for years now required additional documentation, notarizations, and fees. The center's director, a retired Navy commander named Robert Chen, found himself drowning in red tape. "Alex, I don't understand what's happening," Chen confided during their weekly staff meeting. "We've operated here for 8 years without problems. Now suddenly we need permits for everything, from our parking lot to our copy machine." Alex suspected she knew exactly what was happening.
But she kept her suspicions to herself. She'd learned in combat that accusations without evidence only made you look paranoid. Instead, she began documenting everything. Every interaction with city officials, every new requirement, every mysterious delay. Her military training had taught her the value of detailed record-keeping. The harassment campaign escalated when Alex went to renew her driver's license. The DMV office in Cedar Falls had always been efficient, but suddenly Alex's paperwork was incomplete. Her birth certificate wasn't notarized correctly. Her proof of residence wasn't acceptable. Each visit required new documentation, and each rejection came with a smile from the clerk who clearly recognized Alex from somewhere. After her third trip to the DMV, Alex realized she was being watched. The same Cedar Falls Police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror during routine trips around town. It never pulled her over, never turned on its lights, but it was always there, a constant reminder that she was being monitored. The breaking point came when Alex tried to help a fellow veteran named Marcus Torres with his disability claim. Torres had lost his leg to an IED in Syria and was struggling to navigate the VA bureaucracy. Alex had successfully helped dozens of veterans with similar claims, but Torres' case seemed to face unusual obstacles. Every form was rejected for minor errors, every appointment was rescheduled at the last minute, every piece of documentation required additional verification. When Alex accompanied Torres to the VA office in the next county, she was told that her presence was disruptive and that she was no longer welcome to assist other veterans with their claims. "Miss Washington," the VA official explained with bureaucratic politeness, "we've received reports about your aggressive advocacy style. Perhaps it would be better if Mr. Torres worked with one of our in-house representatives." Alex knew a coordinated attack when she saw one. Someone had been making phone calls, pulling strings, using influence to turn every institution against her. The campaign was too sophisticated, too well organized to be coincidental. That evening, Alex called Captain Lisa Morales, her former commanding officer and closest friend from their deployment days. Lisa was now stationed at Camp Pendleton, just 20 miles from Cedar Falls, serving as a logistics coordinator for the National Guard. "Hawk, I need to ask you something and I need you to be straight with me," Alex said over the secure phone line they'd maintained since leaving active duty. "Shoot, Tank, what's going on?" Alex explained the systematic harassment, the bureaucratic obstacles, the feeling that she was being targeted by local authorities. She expected Lisa to tell her she was being paranoid, that small-town bureaucracy was always frustrating, that she should just keep her head down and wait for things to blow over. Instead, Lisa's response chilled Alex to the bone. "Tank, you're the third person to call me with a story like this. 2 other veterans in your area have reported similar problems. Someone's running a campaign against military families, and they're good at it." Alex felt her stomach drop. How many others? That I know of, at least 6, maybe more. All veterans, all facing the same pattern of harassment. Code violations, permit problems, traffic stops, bureaucratic obstacles. It's like someone's trying to drive military families out of the area. As Alex hung up the phone, she realized that her encounter with Chief Blackwood hadn't been random harassment. It had been the opening shot in a war she hadn't known was being fought. Vernon Blackwood wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was running a systematic campaign to drive veterans out of Cedar Falls. But Alex had survived 3 combat tours by learning to recognize enemy tactics and respond accordingly. If Blackwood wanted a war, she was prepared to give him one. She just needed to understand the full scope of his operation first. The next morning, Alex began her own intelligence-gathering mission. Time to find out exactly what Chief Vernon Blackwood had been doing to her fellow veterans, and time to start fighting back.
Alex's investigation into Blackwood's campaign began at Maria's Diner, a small, family-owned restaurant on the edge of Cedar Falls that had become an unofficial gathering place for local veterans. The owner, Maria Santos, was a 60-year-old woman whose son had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being killed by a roadside bomb in 2021. She understood the sacrifices military families made, and her diner had become a safe haven where veterans could share a meal and their stories without judgment. "Mija," Maria said as Alex slid into a corner booth. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Alex accepted the coffee Maria poured without being asked. "Been doing some research, Mrs. Santos, about what's been happening to veterans in this town." Maria's expression grew serious as she glanced around the nearly empty diner. It was early morning, before the usual breakfast rush, giving them privacy to talk openly. "You mean Chief Blackwood's war?" The blunt statement caught Alex off guard. "You know about it?" "Honey, I've been watching that man destroy lives for 5 years now, ever since the military family started moving to town." Maria sat down across from Alex, her weathered hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. "He started small, extra attention during traffic stops, delayed permits for veteran-owned businesses, mysterious code violations. But it's gotten worse." Alex pulled out a notebook, her military training demanding proper documentation. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Maria painted a picture of systematic harassment that was both more extensive and more sophisticated than Alex had imagined. Blackwood's campaign wasn't random cruelty. It was strategic warfare designed to drive military families out of Cedar Falls while maintaining plausible deniability. Sergeant Miguel Reyes was first, Marine, 3 tours in Iraq, opened an auto repair shop in 2019. Suddenly, his business license needed additional inspections. Fire department found safety violations that didn't exist the month before. Environmental services claimed he was improperly disposing of fluids. Every week brought a new problem, a new fine, a new requirement. Miguel fought for 8 months before giving up and moving his family to Oceanside. Alex scribbled moots, recognizing the pattern. What happened to his shop? Sold to Blackwood's brother-in-law at half its value. Now it's a used car lot that somehow passes every inspection without problems. The story got worse. Captain Jennifer Liu, an Army intelligence officer, had tried to open a security consulting firm. Her applications disappeared from city offices. Required documents were mysteriously lost. When she finally received approval after months of delays, the fire marshal condemned her building the day before opening, citing violations that would cost $50,000 to fix. "She's a smart woman," Maria continued, started documenting everything, taking photos, recording conversations, but when she tried to file complaints, she discovered that half the city council owed Blackwood favors. The other half were afraid of him. Alex felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of favors?" Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Traffic tickets that disappeared, DUI arrests that got buried, building permits that bypassed normal procedures. Blackwood's been collecting debts and leverage for decades. Anyone who might stand up to him has skeletons he's helped hide." The scope of Blackwood's corruption was staggering, but it was his targeting of disabled veterans that truly revealed his cruelty. Staff Sergeant David Martinez had lost his right leg to an IED in Syria and returned home to Cedar Falls hoping to start fresh. He'd used his VA disability benefits to buy a small house near the veteran housing complex, planning to work part-time while attending college on the GI Bill. Blackwood had made Martinez's life a living hell. Parking tickets for his disabled placard being improperly displayed, citations for his service dog being off-leash even when the animal was clearly performing trained tasks, noise complaints from neighbors who claimed Martinez's prosthetic leg was too loud when he walked across his hardwood floors. Martinez tried to fight back, filing complaints with the state attorney general, contacted his congressman, even reached out to veteran advocacy groups. But Blackwood's people got to them first. Suddenly, David's disability benefits were under review, his college applications faced unusual scrutiny, his medical records were somehow leaked to local employers. The pattern was clear and devastating. Blackwood would identify veterans who showed leadership potential, independent thinking, or an unwillingness to be intimidated. Then he would systematically destroy their ability to build lives in Cedar Falls through a combination of bureaucratic harassment, economic pressure, and social isolation. But Alex's case was different, and she was beginning to understand why. Unlike the other veterans, she hadn't tried to start a business or make herself a visible target. She'd simply refused to be intimidated during that first traffic stop. To Blackwood, her defiance represented something more dangerous than economic competition. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Mrs. Santos, Alex said, closing her notebook, how many veterans has he driven out? That I know of, 15 families over the past 3 years. But I suspect there are more who left quietly, too intimidated to fight back or too ashamed to admit they'd been defeated by a small-town tyrant. Alex thanked Maria for her honesty and left the diner with a heavy heart and a clear mission. 15 families destroyed, dozens of lives ruined, careers ended, dreams shattered, all because one corrupt man couldn't tolerate the presence of people who'd served something larger than themselves. But as Alex drove through the streets of Cedar Falls, she began to notice something Blackwood had overlooked in his campaign of intimidation. The veteran community might have been fractured and demoralized, but it hadn't been eliminated. Veterans were still arriving in the area, drawn by job opportunities at Camp Pendleton and the nearby naval facilities. New families were moving into the housing complex, unaware of the systematic harassment that awaited them. Alex's phone buzzed with a text message from Tony Bulldog Rivera, her former sergeant and closest friend from their deployment days. Tank, heard you're having problems with local law enforcement. Free this weekend if you want backup. The message sparked an idea that would have made Sun Tzu proud. If Blackwood was waging war against isolated individuals, perhaps it was time to remind him what happened when you targeted people trained to fight as a unit. Alex spent the rest of the week quietly reaching out to other veterans in the area, both those who'd been harassed and those who hadn't yet caught Blackwood's attention. She used her connections from the assistance center, her contacts from deployment, and the informal networks that connected military families across the region. What she discovered was both encouraging and alarming. There were more veterans in the Cedar Falls area than Blackwood realized, at least 40 families, including several active-duty personnel stationed at Camp Pendleton. Many had experienced harassment but assumed they were isolated cases. Others had heard rumors but dismissed them as paranoia. Most importantly, Alex learned that several veterans had been documenting Blackwood's harassment independently. Captain Jennifer Liu still had her recordings and photographs. Sergeant Martinez had kept detailed logs before leaving town. Even Maria Santos had been collecting evidence, hoping someday someone would be brave enough to use it. By Friday evening, Alex had assembled a dossier that would have impressed her old intelligence officers. Blackwood's pattern of harassment was clear, documented, and undeniable. His methods were systematic and repeated. His corruption extended throughout city government. But Alex knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Blackwood had survived for decades by ensuring that anyone with the power to challenge him was either bought, intimidated, or compromised. The system was rigged in his favor, and playing by his rules would only result in more veterans being driven out of town. As she sat in her small apartment that evening, reviewing the evidence she had gathered, Alex made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Bulldog, it's Tank. Remember how you said you were free this weekend? I think it's time to show these local heroes what a real veteran reunion looks like. Tony Rivera's response was immediate and enthusiastic. How many do you need, Tank? Alex smiled for the first time in weeks. Bring everyone. It's time Chief Blackwood met some people who don't scare easily. The war was about to escalate, but this time, Alex wouldn't be fighting alone. She was about to remind Cedar Falls that veterans might be willing to sacrifice for their country, but they would never surrender to bullies and tyrants, no matter how many badges and uniforms they hid behind.
Alex's first attempt to fight Blackwood through official channels began on Monday morning at the Cedar Falls City Hall, a modest 2-story building that housed the mayor's office, city council chambers, and various administrative departments. She'd spent the weekend preparing her case, organizing the evidence she'd gathered, and researching the proper procedures for filing formal complaints against police misconduct. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Janet Pierce, looked uncomfortable the moment Alex introduced herself. I'd like to file a formal complaint against Chief Blackwood for harassment and abuse of power, Alex said, presenting the folder containing her documentation. Janet's face went pale. Complaints against the police department need to go through internal affairs, but we don't have an internal affairs department here in Cedar Falls. Chief Blackwood handles all personnel matters internally. Alex blinked in disbelief. You're telling me that complaints against the chief of police have to be filed with the chief of police? That's
That's how it's always been done, Janet stammered, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Maybe you could try the county sheriff's office or the state attorney general. Alex thanked Janet and left City Hall with a clearer understanding of how Blackwood had maintained power for so long. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was designed to protect him from accountability. Every official channel led back to Blackwood himself or to officials who owed him favors. Her next stop was the county sheriff's office, where she hoped to find law enforcement officials who operated independently of Cedar Falls politics. Sheriff Robert Martinez, no relation to the veteran David Martinez, who'd been driven out of town, listened to Alex's complaints with what appeared to be genuine concern. Miss Washington, what you're describing sounds serious, Sheriff Martinez said after reviewing Alex's documentation. But I have to be honest with you, jurisdictional issues make this complicated. Chief Blackwood operates within Cedar Falls city limits, which gives him broad discretionary authority over local law enforcement matters. Alex leaned forward. Sheriff, he's systematically targeting veterans and their families. This goes beyond normal police work. I understand your frustration, but my hands are tied unless he commits crimes outside city limits or unless federal authorities get involved. Have you considered contacting the FBI? The suggestion that she might need federal intervention to address local police corruption would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. Alex thanked Sheriff Martinez for his honesty and left with the growing realization that Blackwood's protection ran deeper than she'd imagined. Her attempt to contact the FBI proved even more frustrating. The special agent she spoke with over the phone was polite but discouraging. Civil rights violations by local law enforcement are certainly within our jurisdiction, Agent Sarah Coleman explained, but we need evidence of systematic patterns affecting large numbers of people, and we need clear documentation of federal law violations. Alex tried to explain the scope of Blackwood's campaign, but Agent Coleman's response revealed the bureaucratic obstacles that protected corrupt officials like Blackwood. Miss Washington, what you're describing could certainly constitute harassment, but much of it appears to involve local administrative actions that don't clearly violate federal law. Traffic citations, building permits, business licenses, these are typically state and local matters. What about targeting veterans specifically? Isn't that discrimination? Military status isn't a protected class under federal civil rights law in the same way that race or religion are. We'd need evidence that Chief Blackwood was violating specific federal statutes, not just engaging in selective enforcement of local laws. Alex hung up the phone feeling like she'd been slapped. The federal government would send soldiers halfway around the world to fight for democracy and freedom, but when those same soldiers came home to face harassment from local corrupt officials, the system offered them no protection. Her final attempt to work within the system was a meeting with Cedar Falls Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a woman who held office for 12 years and had built her political career on maintaining the status quo. The mayor's office was decorated with photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity events, and handshake sessions with various local officials, including several prominent pictures with Chief Blackwood. Miss Washington, Mayor Hendricks began with the practiced smile of a career politician, I understand you have some concerns about our police department.
Alex presented her evidence methodically, explaining the pattern of harassment, the systematic targeting of veterans, and the documentation she'd gathered from multiple sources. Mayor Hendricks listened with apparent interest, occasionally nodding and taking notes. This is very concerning, the mayor said when Alex finished. I want you to know that Cedar Falls values our military families tremendously. We would never tolerate the kind of behavior you're describing. Alex felt a spark of hope until the mayor continued. However, I have to tell you that Chief Blackwood has been an exemplary law enforcement officer for nearly 3 decades. His record is spotless, and he's received numerous commendations from community organizations. Without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing, I have concrete evidence, Alex interrupted, gesturing to the folder on the mayor's desk. What I see here are largely administrative matters and routine police work. Traffic citations, permit delays, standard inspections. While I understand these situations can be frustrating, I don't see clear evidence of the systematic harassment you're alleging. Alex realized she was listening to a carefully rehearsed response. Mayor Hendricks had no intention of investigating Blackwood. She was performing political theater designed to make Alex feel heard while taking no meaningful action. Miss Washington, let me suggest a different approach. Why don't you try working with Chief Blackwood directly? I'm sure if you sat down with him and explained your concerns, you could resolve this misunderstanding. The suggestion that Alex should voluntarily meet with the man who'd been systematically harassing her was so absurd that she almost laughed. Instead, she gathered her evidence and stood to leave. Mayor Hendricks, let me ask you directly. Has Chief Blackwood ever done favors for you or members of the city council? Has he ever made problems disappear or used his position to help local politicians? The mayor's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. Miss Washington, I think this meeting is over. Chief Blackwood is a dedicated public servant, and I won't sit here and listen to baseless accusations. As Alex left City Hall for the second time that week, she understood why Blackwood had operated with impunity for so long. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Local officials protected each other, federal authorities required impossibly high standards of evidence, and individual citizens were left to face institutional corruption alone. But Alex's military training had taught her that when conventional tactics failed, it was time to consider unconventional approaches. She'd tried working within the system and found it rigged against her. Now it was time to remind Blackwood and his political allies that some battles couldn't be won through bureaucracy and intimidation. That evening, Alex made a series of phone calls to her military contacts, explaining the situation and asking for advice. The responses were remarkably consistent. Every veteran she spoke with had either experienced similar harassment in other communities or knew someone who had. Captain Lisa Hawk Morales was particularly blunt. Tank, you're fighting a war with peace treaty rules while they're using biological weapons. The system isn't designed to protect people like us. It's designed to protect people like Blackwood. So what do you suggest? Asked Alex. Stop playing by their rules. Start playing by ours. Alex understood exactly what Lisa meant. Military tactics weren't just about weapons and combat. They were about organization, planning, intelligence gathering, and coordinated action. If Blackwood wanted to wage war against veterans, perhaps it was time to show him what veterans looked like when they fought back as a unit. The conversation with Lisa planted the seed of an idea that would eventually require 6 Black Hawk helicopters and 200 Marines to fully execute. But for now, Alex focused on the first phase of her plan, gathering intelligence and building a coalition that could stand up to Blackwood's machine of corruption. The system had failed her, but Alex Washington hadn't survived 3 combat tours by depending on systems. She'd survived by adapting, improvising, and never giving up. Blackwood had made a critical error in targeting someone trained to fight asymmetric warfare. The real battle was about to begin.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Alex's breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in November, 3 weeks after her failed attempts to work within the system. She was driving home from the Veterans Assistance Center when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank as she recognized the familiar silhouette of Chief Blackwood's patrol car. She pulled over on Maple Street, just 2 blocks from the veteran housing complex where she lived. The location wasn't coincidental. Blackwood had chosen the spot carefully, ensuring that other veterans would witness whatever humiliation he had planned. This time, Blackwood wasn't alone. Officer Kruger emerged from the passenger seat while Blackwood approached Alex's driver's side window. The presence of a witness suggested that tonight would be different, more serious than their previous encounters. "License and registration," Blackwood demanded without preamble, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed at Alex's eyes. Alex complied, handing over the documents while trying to understand what traffic violation she could possibly have committed. She'd been driving exactly the speed limit, had come to complete stops at every sign, and hadn't used her phone or shown any signs of distraction. "Do you know why I stopped you, Sergeant Washington?" Blackwood's voice carried a tone of mock professionalism that fooled no one. "No, sir, I don't."
reckless driving, failure to maintain proper lane position, possible impairment. Each accusation was delivered with the confidence of someone who knew his word would be accepted over hers. Alex felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. "Chief, I haven't been drinking and I was driving safely. My lane position was—" "Step out of the vehicle," Blackwood ordered, his hand moving to his weapon. "Now." As Alex complied, she noticed movement in the windows of nearby apartments. Other veterans were watching behind curtains and blinds, witnessing but unwilling to intervene. She couldn't blame them. Blackwood's campaign of intimidation had been effective in teaching the veteran community that resistance only brought more harassment. What happened next would be captured on Blackwood's body camera, though the footage would later reveal details that contradicted his official report. Kruger began a field sobriety test that was more theater than procedure, while Blackwood circled Alex's car like a predator, searching for weakness. "You seem pretty steady for someone who's been drinking," Blackwood said, echoing his words from their first encounter. "But I can smell alcohol on your breath." "Chief, I haven't had a drink in over a week," Alex replied, her military training helping her maintain composure despite the obvious setup. "Are you calling me a liar?" Blackwood stepped closer, invading Alex's personal space in a clear attempt to provoke a reaction. "I'm stating facts. I haven't been drinking, I wasn't driving recklessly, and this stop appears to be based on personal animosity rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Blackwood's face flushed with anger at being called out so directly, especially with other veterans watching from their windows. His carefully constructed facade of professional law enforcement was cracking, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Blackwood snarled, abandoning any pretense of professionalism. "You think that uniform you used to wear makes you special? Let me tell you something, Sergeant. In my town, you're nothing but another troublemaker who needs to learn her place." Kruger shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his boss was crossing lines that could create legal problems later. But Blackwood was beyond caring about consequences. 3 weeks of Alex's resistance had eaten away at his control, and he was determined to end this challenge to his authority once and for all. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Blackwood ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "On what charge?" Alex demanded, her voice carrying across the street to the veterans watching from their windows. "Driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer." The last charge was particularly audacious since Alex hadn't made any aggressive moves or threatened anyone. But Blackwood knew that his word would be accepted over hers in court, and he was confident that the veteran community was too intimidated to testify on her behalf. Alex felt the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking around her wrists and knew she was facing a moment that would define everything that followed. She could submit quietly, accept whatever charges Blackwood fabricated, and hope that the system would eventually vindicate her. Or she could make a choice that would escalate this conflict beyond anything Cedar Falls had ever seen. "Chief Blackwood," Alex said clearly, her voice carrying to every apartment window where veterans were watching, "I am not resisting arrest. I have not been drinking, and I have committed no crime. What you're doing right now is a violation of my civil rights and abuse of your authority as a police officer." Blackwood shoved her roughly against her car, the impact hard enough to leave bruises. "Shut your mouth and get in the car." But Alex wasn't finished. 3 tours in combat zones had taught her that sometimes you had to take a stand, regardless of the consequences. "This is Staff Sergeant Alexandra Washington, United States Army, service number 123-456-789. I am being falsely arrested by Chief Vernon Blackwood of the Cedar Falls Police Department on fabricated charges. I am requesting that any witnesses document this encounter and contact my emergency contact, Captain Lisa Morales at Camp Pendleton." The formal declaration, delivered in Alex's clear military cadence, had an immediate effect. Apartment doors began opening as veterans emerged from their homes. Cell phone cameras appeared at windows. The community that Blackwood had successfully intimidated into silence was suddenly documenting his actions. Blackwood realized he was losing control of the situation. "Everyone get back inside," he shouted at the growing crowd of witnesses. "This is police business." But the veterans didn't retreat. They stood on their porches and sidewalks, many still wearing military clothing or veteran caps, forming a silent wall of witnesses that stretched down both sides of Maple Street. Among them was Carlos Santos, Maria's husband, who began live streaming the arrest on his phone. "You people need to disperse immediately or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business," Kruger warned. But his voice lacked conviction. Even he could see that arresting dozens of veterans would create a public relations nightmare. Alex was pushed into the back of Blackwood's patrol car, but her message had been delivered. Within minutes, the live stream from Carlos Santos was being shared across social media platforms and military networks. Captain Lisa Morales received 3 separate phone calls before Blackwood's car had left Maple Street. But the most significant call went to Tony "Bulldog" Rivera, who was attending a training exercise at Camp Pendleton when his phone exploded with notifications about Alex's arrest. Rivera watched the live stream with growing fury, then made a decision that would bring the full weight of military brotherhood down on Cedar Falls. "Get me Colonel Jackson," Rivera told his aide, "and find out how many Marines we have available for immediate deployment. We've got a situation developing." As Blackwood's patrol car disappeared into the night with Alex in custody, the veteran community of Cedar Falls began mobilizing in ways that would have made their former commanding officers proud. Phone calls were made, networks activated, and resources marshaled. Within an hour, Camp Pendleton was buzzing with activity as news of Alex's arrest spread through the ranks. Within 2 hours, Colonel Robert "Iron Mike" Jackson was reviewing footage of the arrest and consulting with military legal advisors about appropriate responses. By midnight, 6 Black Hawk helicopters were being prepared for what would officially be described as a training exercise in the Cedar Falls area. 200 Marines were being briefed on a mission that would demonstrate the difference between civilian law enforcement and military precision. Chief Vernon Blackwood had finally picked a fight with someone who had backup. He just didn't know it yet.
Captain Lisa "Hawk" Morales was reviewing supply requisitions in her office at Camp Pendleton when her secure phone rang at 9:47 p.m. She'd been expecting the call ever since receiving the first reports about Alex's arrest, but hearing Tony Rivera's voice on the other end still sent a chill down her spine. "Hawk, they've got Tank," Rivera said without preamble. "False arrest, trumped-up charges, the whole 9 yards. We watched it happen on livestream." Lisa had been Alex's commanding officer for 2 tours and knew her better than anyone. If Alex was in custody, it wasn't because she'd committed a crime. It was because someone had finally pushed her past her breaking point. What's her status? Locked up in Cedar Falls jail on DUI charges that are complete bullshit. But Hawk, this isn't just about Tank. We've been digging into this Chief Blackwood character, and he's been systematically targeting veterans for years. This is bigger than one arrest. Lisa pulled up her computer and began accessing databases that most civilians didn't know existed. Military personnel had resources for protecting their own that went far beyond civilian law enforcement capabilities. "Give me everything you have." Over the next hour, Rivera briefed Lisa on the intelligence Alex had gathered, the pattern of harassment documented by multiple veterans, and the systematic campaign of intimidation that had been driving military families out of Cedar Falls. By the time Rivera finished, Lisa understood that Alex's arrest wasn't just personal, it was an attack on the entire veteran community. "How many of our people are in the area?" Lisa asked, her mind already shifting into operational planning mode. "Active duty? Maybe 50 Marines and sailors within 20 miles. But if we expand to reserves, National Guard, and recently discharged veterans, we're looking at over 200 people who served with distinction and won't tolerate seeing their brothers and sisters abused by corrupt cops." Lisa made a decision that would have made her Pentagon superiors proud and terrified in equal measure. "Rivera, start making calls. I want every veteran in the region to know what happened tonight. And I want documentation. Video, audio, witness statements, everything. If Chief Blackwood wants to wage war against veterans, He's about to learn what happens when veterans fight back as a unit. Meanwhile, at Camp Pendleton's main administration building, Colonel Robert Iron Mike Jackson was having his own crisis management meeting. Jackson was a 30-year Marine veteran who'd earned his nickname during the Battle of Fallujah, where his tactical brilliance and absolute refusal to abandon wounded Marines had become legendary. He'd built his career on protecting his people, and the reports coming out of Cedar Falls were triggering every protective instinct he'd developed over 3 decades of service. "Sir," his aide, Major Patricia Wilson, reported as she entered Jackson's office with a thick folder. "We've got confirmation that Staff Sergeant Washington's arrest was witnessed by multiple veterans, all of whom report that the charges appear fabricated. More concerning, we've identified at least 15 other veterans who've been systematically harassed by this same police chief." Jackson reviewed the evidence with the methodical precision that had made him one of the Corps' most respected commanders. What he saw wasn't just individual cases of police misconduct, it was a coordinated campaign against military families that demanded a coordinated response. "Major, what are our options for legal intervention?" "Limited, sir. Civilian law enforcement has broad discretionary authority, and military personnel are subject to civilian jurisdiction when off base. However, if we can document a pattern of civil rights violations specifically targeting military families, we might have grounds for federal intervention." Jackson leaned back in his chair, considering his options. The military couldn't simply override civilian authority without proper justification, but they also couldn't stand by while veterans were being systematically abused. There had to be a middle ground that protected his people while respecting the law. "Major, what training exercises do we have scheduled for tomorrow?" Wilson consulted her planning calendar. "Nothing specific, sir. We have several units available for field training if needed." Jackson smiled criminally. "Then I think it's time we conducted some community outreach exercises in Cedar Falls area. Nothing official, nothing that would interfere with civilian law enforcement, just Marines demonstrating their training capabilities in a public setting."
Within hours, the military machinery that had conquered Afghanistan and Iraq was turning its attention to a small California town. Phone calls were made to Pentagon contacts who owed Jackson favors. Intelligence assets began gathering information on Cedar Falls' political structure. Legal experts started researching federal statutes that might apply to systematic harassment of military families. But it was the grassroots mobilization of the veteran community that would prove most effective. Tony Rivera's network of former military personnel began spreading word through unofficial channels that reached from San Diego to Los Angeles. Social media posts started appearing on veteran forums, Facebook groups, and Twitter feeds. The live stream of Alex's arrest had been viewed over 50,000 times by midnight. Comments poured in from veterans across the country who recognized the pattern of harassment and abuse. Similar stories emerged from other communities where corrupt officials had targeted military families, creating a nationwide conversation about the treatment of veterans by local law enforcement. Maria Santos found herself at the center of this growing movement when her husband's live stream went viral. Her diner became an unofficial command center where veterans gathered to share information and coordinate their response. By dawn, she was serving coffee to active-duty Marines, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Air Force pilots who'd driven from across Southern California to support one of their own. "Mija," Maria told Lisa Morales when the captain arrived at the diner at 6 a.m., "I've never seen anything like this. These boys and girls are ready to go to war for your friend." Lisa surveyed the crowd of military personnel filling Maria's diner and felt a surge of pride. This was what military brotherhood looked like. Not the Hollywood version of dramatic speeches and flag waving, but the quiet, determined solidarity of professionals who'd sworn to protect each other. "Mrs. Santos, we're not going to war," Lisa replied. "We're going to remind Chief Blackwood what happens when you mess with people who've dedicated their lives to protecting others." At 8 a.m., Colonel Jackson held a briefing that would have impressed NATO commanders. Using satellite imagery, intelligence reports, and legal analysis that rivaled Pentagon operations, he laid out a plan that would demonstrate military precision without violating civilian authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jackson addressed the assembled officers,
We have a situation where American veterans are being systematically harassed by corrupt local officials. Our response will be measured, professional, and absolutely devastating to anyone who thinks they can abuse our people with impunity. The plan Jackson unveiled was elegant in its simplicity. Multiple training exercises would converge on the Cedar Falls area, creating a massive military presence that was completely legal and thoroughly intimidating. Black Hawk helicopters would conduct low-altitude training flights over the town. Marine units would practice urban operations in public areas. Military vehicles would participate in convoy training along local highways. Every action would be legitimate military training, but the combined effect would demonstrate the resources and capabilities that the veteran community could call upon when threatened. It was psychological warfare disguised as routine military operations. But the most important element of Jackson's plan was the legal framework he'd constructed. Military lawyers had identified federal statutes that applied to systematic harassment of military families. Evidence was being compiled that would support federal intervention if local authorities failed to address the corruption. Chief Blackwood picked the wrong fight, Jackson concluded his briefing. He's about to learn that when you target one veteran, you're targeting all of us, and we have resources he can't imagine. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Alex sat in her jail cell, unaware that the largest military mobilization in California since World War II was being organized on her behalf. She'd made her stand as one soldier fighting alone against corruption. Now she was about to discover what happened when that soldier's military family decided to stand with her. The battle for Cedar Falls was about to begin in earnest.
At precisely 800 hours on Friday morning, the residents of Cedar Falls woke to a sound that hadn't been heard in their quiet town since World War II, the rhythmic thunder of military helicopters approaching from the south. Chief Vernon Blackwood was drinking his morning coffee in his office when the first Black Hawk appeared over the horizon, flying low and fast toward the center of town. "What the hell is that?" Officer Kruger asked, rushing to the window as the helicopter's rotor wash rattled the police station's windows. Blackwood set down his coffee cup with hands that were suddenly less steady than they'd been moments before. In his 28 years of terrorizing Cedar Falls, he'd never seen military aircraft operating in his jurisdiction. The sight of the Black Hawk circling the town square like a predatory bird sent a chill down his spine that he couldn't quite explain. The helicopter was followed by a second, then a third, until 6 Black Hawks were conducting what appeared to be routine training exercises directly over Cedar Falls. But veterans in the area recognized the flight patterns. These weren't training exercises. This was a show of force. Alex watched from her jail cell window as the helicopters circled overhead, their presence transforming the atmosphere of the small town from sleepy suburban calm to something resembling a military operation zone. She didn't know who had called in the cavalry, but she recognized the message being sent. At the veteran housing complex on Maple Street, Tony Rivera stepped out of his rental car and looked up at the Blackhawks with professional appreciation. As a former helicopter mechanic, he understood the precision required to coordinate 6 aircraft in such tight formation over a civilian area. Someone with serious military connections was making a statement. Rivera wasn't alone. Over the past 12 hours, veterans had been arriving in Cedar Falls from across Southern California. They came in pickup trucks with military bumper stickers, motorcycles ridden by grizzled Marines, and rental cars driven by active-duty personnel on weekend passes. By dawn, nearly 200 veterans had gathered in and around Cedar Falls, creating the largest concentration of military personnel Cedar Falls had ever seen. The convergence wasn't accidental. Captain Lisa Morales had spent the night coordinating what would officially be described as a veteran reunion and community outreach event. Every arrival was legal, every gathering was peaceful, and every participant was a decorated military veteran with impeccable credentials. But Chief Blackwood wasn't stupid. As he watched the helicopters circle his town and observed the growing crowd of military personnel, he understood that Alex's arrest had triggered something far beyond his ability to control. His phone had been ringing nonstop since dawn, with calls from county officials, state representatives, and federal agencies asking pointed questions about his treatment of local veterans. "Chief," Kruger said nervously, "maybe we should consider releasing Washington on her own recognizance. This situation is getting out of hand." Blackwood's jaw tightened. Releasing Alex would be an admission that her arrest had been unjustified, potentially opening him up to civil rights violations and federal investigation. But keeping her in custody while hundreds of her military brothers and sisters gathered outside was beginning to feel like a serious tactical error. The decision was taken out of his hands when Colonel Robert Jackson's staff car pulled up in front of the police station. Jackson emerged in full dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of 3 decades defending American interests around the globe. He was accompanied by Major Patricia Wilson and a military lawyer whose presence suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Chief Blackwood," Jackson said as he entered the police station, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Colonel Robert Jackson, commanding officer at Camp Pendleton. I believe you have one of my veterans in custody." Chief Blackwood tried to maintain his composure, but he was clearly out of his depth. "Colonel, this is a local law enforcement matter. Military personnel are subject to civilian authority when off base." "Absolutely correct, which is why I'm here as a concerned citizen and advocate for veteran rights. Though I should mention that Staff Sergeant Washington's case has attracted attention from some very interesting federal agencies." As if on cue, a black SUV with federal license plates pulled up behind Jackson's staff car. 2 FBI agents emerged, their presence adding another layer of pressure to what was already an explosive situation. Special Agent Sarah Coleman, the same agent who had dismissed Alex's initial complaint weeks earlier, approached the police station with a very different attitude than she'd displayed during their phone conversation. "Chief Blackwood, I'm Agent Coleman with the FBI Civil Rights Division. We'd like to discuss some allegations regarding systematic harassment of military families in your jurisdiction." Blackwood felt the walls closing in around him. Federal agents, military officers, hundreds of veterans, and 6 Blackhawks circling overhead had transformed his quiet morning into a nightmare scenario that threatened everything he'd built over nearly 3 decades. "I want to see my attorney," Blackwood said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "That's certainly your right," Agent Coleman replied. "But first, we need to discuss the immediate release of Staff Sergeant Washington and the evidence we've received regarding your department's treatment of veteran families." Outside the police station, the crowd of veterans had grown to nearly 300 people. They stood in perfect formation along Main Street, not blocking traffic or creating disturbances, but their mere presence was more intimidating than any protest could have been. These were people who'd faced enemy fire in Iraq and Afghanistan, who'd stormed beaches and jumped from planes and conducted raids in hostile territory. A small-town police chief's attempt at intimidation seemed almost quaint by comparison. Maria Santos had opened her diner early to serve coffee and breakfast to the assembled veterans, transforming the modest restaurant into a command center where military personnel coordinated their response to Alex's situation. The atmosphere was calm but determined. These people weren't looking for confrontation, but they weren't backing down either. At 10:30 a.m., the police station doors opened and Alex walked out, flanked by Colonel Jackson and Agent Coleman. The charges against her had been dropped, her record cleared, and her property returned. But more importantly, federal investigators were now actively examining Chief Blackwood's entire operation. The crowd of veterans erupted in cheers that could be heard for miles, their voices mixing with the sound of helicopter rotors as the Black Hawks performed a final pass over the town square. Alex looked up at the aircraft and felt tears streaming down her face, not from relief at her release, but from overwhelming gratitude for the military family that had refused to abandon her. Tony Rivera pushed through the crowd and embraced Alex with the fierce affection of someone who'd shared foxholes and firefights with her. "Tank, you beautiful, stubborn jarhead, did you really think we'd let some small-town dictator mess with one of ours?"
Alex looked around at the hundreds of veterans who dropped everything to support her, at the federal agents now investigating Blackwood's corruption, at the military helicopters that had turned her small-town legal problem into a national statement about veteran solidarity. "I never asked for this," she said quietly. "You didn't have to," Captain Morales replied, appearing at Alex's side. "That's what military family means. When one of us is under attack, all of us respond." Chief Vernon Blackwood watched from his office window as Alex was reunited with her military brothers and sisters, understanding that his world was about to change in ways he couldn't control or predict. The federal investigation would expose decades of corruption. His political allies would distance themselves. His carefully constructed empire of fear and intimidation would crumble. But for Alex and the veteran community of Cedar Falls, this moment represented something more powerful than justice. It was proof that the bonds forged in military service transcend civilian politics, that veterans truly never leave anyone behind, and that sometimes the best response to a bully is an overwhelming demonstration of the resources and solidarity your military family can bring to bear. The battle for Cedar Falls was over. The veterans had won.
The FBI investigation into Chief Vernon Blackwood's operations began within hours of Alex's release and quickly revealed a level of corruption that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Agent Sarah Coleman had initially dismissed Alex's complaints as isolated incidents, but the evidence that poured in over the following weeks painted a picture of systematic abuse that spanned nearly a decade. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Janet Pierce, the nervous City Hall receptionist who'd been unable to help Alex file her initial complaint, approached FBI agents with a confession that opened the floodgates of evidence. For 8 years, Janet had been secretly documenting Blackwood's visits to City Hall, his private meetings with Mayor Hendricks, and the administrative manipulations that had made his harassment campaigns possible. "I knew what he was doing was wrong," Janet told Agent Coleman during a recorded interview, "but I was scared. Chief Blackwood made it clear that anyone who crossed him would lose their job, face harassment, or worse. I started keeping records because I hoped someday someone would be brave enough to use them." Janet's files contained meticulously documented evidence of Blackwood's coordination with city officials. Email chains showed how building permits were delayed for veteran-owned businesses. Phone logs revealed conversations about problem residents who needed special attention. Most damning were recorded meetings where Blackwood and Mayor Hendricks discussed specific strategies for driving military families out of Cedar Falls. "We need to make it clear that this town has standards," Blackwood's voice said on one recording from 2019. "These military types come in thinking they're heroes, but they don't understand how things work here. A little pressure in the right places, and they'll move on to somewhere that appreciates their contributions." The FBI's financial investigation revealed the economic motivations behind Blackwood's campaign. Property values in Cedar Falls had been artificially suppressed in areas with high veteran populations, allowing Blackwood's associates to purchase homes and businesses at below-market prices. Once military families were driven out, these properties were resold at significant profits. The scheme had generated over $2.3 million in illegal profits over 5 years, with Blackwood receiving kickbacks through a network of shell companies and consulting contracts. Mayor Hendricks had received $180,000 in campaign contributions from businesses that benefited from the artificially low property values. Even Officer Kruger had received payments for his participation in the harassment campaigns. But the human cost of Blackwood's corruption was far more devastating than the financial crimes. FBI interviews with former Cedar Falls residents revealed the true scope of his campaign against veterans. David Martinez, the disabled veteran who'd been driven to Phoenix, provided 17 hours of recorded testimony detailing the systematic harassment that had destroyed his attempts to build a new life after military service. "They made me feel like I was worthless," Martinez told investigators. "I survived 3 tours in Syria, lost my leg serving my country, and came home to find that none of it mattered to these people. They treated me like a criminal for having the audacity to want a normal life in their town." Jennifer Liu, the former Army intelligence officer whose security consulting firm had been destroyed by artificial obstacles, provided evidence that Blackwood's network extended beyond Cedar Falls. Similar harassment campaigns were operating in at least 6 other California communities, all coordinated through a network of corrupt officials who shared information and tactics. It's not just isolated corruption, she explained to federal investigators. It's an organized effort to keep veterans from establishing roots in certain communities. They've weaponized local government against the people who served this country. The investigation expanded when military lawyers identified potential federal crimes beyond simple corruption. The systematic targeting of veterans violated several federal statutes, including civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and violations of the Service Member Civil Relief Act. Colonel Jackson provided military intelligence resources that civilian investigators rarely accessed. Satellite imagery showed the movement of military families out of Cedar Falls over the past 5 years, creating a clear pattern that correlated with Blackwood's campaigns. Financial analysis revealed suspicious property transactions that form the foundation of the money laundering charges. Most importantly, the military investigation uncovered evidence that Blackwood's harassment had affected active duty personnel, which triggered additional federal jurisdiction and military legal protections. 3 Marines stationed at Camp Pendleton had been systematically harassed while living off base in Cedar Falls, potentially compromising their military readiness and effectiveness. The media attention generated by the military response to Alex's arrest brought forward dozens of additional victims. Local television stations ran investigative reports featuring interviews with veteran families who'd been driven out of Cedar Falls. National news outlets picked up the story, turning Blackwood's local corruption into a symbol of broader mistreatment of veterans across the country. Social media campaigns organized by veteran advocacy groups generated thousands of similar reports from across the nation. #VeteranHarassment and #CedarFallsCorruption became trending hashtags as veterans shared their own stories of systematic mistreatment by local officials. The response revealed that Blackwood's tactics weren't unique. They were part of a nationwide pattern of discrimination against military families. Tony Rivera, who'd become Alex's unofficial spokesman during the crisis, found himself coordinating media interviews and congressional briefings about the broader implications of the case. What happened in Cedar Falls isn't an isolated incident, he told a House Veterans Affairs subcommittee. It's a window into systematic discrimination that veterans face in communities across America. The congressional hearings that followed Alex's case led to new federal legislation protecting veterans from local government harassment. The Veterans Protection Act of 2024 created federal oversight mechanisms for local authorities and established penalties for systematic discrimination against military families. But perhaps the most significant evidence came from Blackwood himself. Faced with overwhelming federal charges and the prospect of spending his remaining years in federal prison, he agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed corruption networks in multiple states and provided evidence for dozens of additional prosecutions. "I thought I was untouchable," Blackwood admitted during his plea hearing. 28 years of getting away with whatever I wanted made me believe I could target anyone without consequences. I never imagined that one veteran's refusal to be intimidated would bring down everything I'd built. The plea agreements extended far beyond Blackwood. Mayor Hendricks resigned and accepted federal charges rather than face trial. Officer Kruger cooperated with investigators and received a suspended sentence in exchange for his testimony. Dozens of city officials, business owners, and political figures who'd participated in the corruption network faced federal prosecution. By the end of 2024, the FBI's investigation had resulted in 37 indictments, $4.2 million in asset forfeitures, and the complete restructuring of Cedar Falls municipal government. More importantly, it had exposed systematic discrimination against veterans that led to federal legislation protecting military families nationwide. Alex watched the investigation unfold with mixed emotions. She was grateful that justice was being served and that other veterans would be protected from similar harassment. But she was also sobered by the scope of corruption that had been operating right under everyone's noses for years. "Tank," Captain Morales told her during one of their regular check-ins, "you did something that changed everything. One person's courage to stand up to a bully exposed an entire network of corruption and led to protections for veterans across the country." Alex nodded, understanding that her personal battle with Chief Blackwood had become something much larger than she had ever intended. Sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for everyone who couldn't fight back. Sometimes refusing to be intimidated by one corrupt official meant protecting thousands of people from systematic abuse. The investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming and justice was finally being served. But for Alex, the real victory wasn't in the courtrooms or congressional hearings. It was in the knowledge that no other veteran would have to face what she had endured alone. 6 months after the military intervention that freed Alex from Cedar Falls jail, Chief Vernon Blackwood stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his police uniform. The transformation was stark. The arrogant tyrant who'd terrorized veterans for nearly a decade now appeared diminished and defeated as he faced sentencing for conspiracy, civil rights violations, money laundering, and racketeering charges. Judge Patricia Hamilton, a federal district judge with 23 years on the bench, reviewed Blackwood's case with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most respected jurists in California. The evidence presented by federal prosecutors painted a picture of corruption so systematic and cruel that it had shocked even experienced federal investigators. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Hamilton began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "In my 2 decades on this bench, I have rarely seen such a comprehensive abuse of public trust. Your systematic targeting of military veterans, people who served this country with honor, represents not just corruption, but a betrayal of the fundamental values this nation was built upon." The courtroom was packed with veterans who'd traveled from across the country to witness Blackwood's downfall. Alex sat in the front row, flanked by Tony Rivera and Captain Lisa Morales, watching as the man who'd made her life a nightmare finally faced consequences for his actions. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case. Over 7 months of investigation, they'd documented 127 separate instances of harassment directed at 43 veteran families. The financial crimes alone had generated over $2.3 million in illegal profits. But it was the human cost that truly captured the court's attention. David Martinez, the disabled veteran who'd been driven out of Cedar Falls, provided victim impact testimony that left the courtroom silent. "Your Honor, I lost my leg serving in Syria, but I lost my faith in America serving under Chief Blackwood's harassment. He made me feel like my sacrifice meant nothing, like veterans were second-class citizens in the country we'd sworn to protect." Jennifer Liu, the former Army intelligence officer whose business had been destroyed by artificial obstacles, testified about the broader implications of Blackwood's crimes. "This wasn't just local corruption, Your Honor. It was part of a coordinated effort to drive veterans out of communities where we might have political influence or economic impact." The prosecution's case was strengthened by Blackwood's own words, captured on recordings that FBI agents had obtained through wiretaps and informants. His voice, dripping with contempt, described veterans as troublemakers and bleeding hearts who needed to be taught their place in his community. "These military types come back thinking they're heroes," Blackwood had said in one recorded conversation with Mayor Hendricks. "But they don't understand that their service doesn't mean anything here. This is my town, and I decide who belongs." Those words came back to haunt him as Judge Hamilton read portions of the transcript aloud during sentencing. "Mr. Blackwood, your own statements reveal a man who viewed military service not as honorable sacrifice, but as a threat to your personal power. You targeted the very people who made your freedom possible." The federal investigation had revealed connections between Blackwood's operation and similar harassment networks in 6 other states. His cooperation with federal investigators led to 43 additional indictments and the exposure of what prosecutors described as the largest systematic discrimination case against veterans in American history. Mayor Patricia Hendricks had already been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. Officer Danny Kruger received 2 years probation in exchange for his cooperation, but was banned from law enforcement for life. Dozens of other officials, business owners, and political figures faced various charges related to their participation in the harassment network. But Blackwood was the mastermind, and federal sentencing guidelines reflected the severity of his crimes. Prosecutors had asked for 25 years in federal prison,
arguing that his systematic targeting of veterans represented a form of domestic terrorism designed to drive military families away from their chosen communities. Your Honor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen argued during the sentencing hearing, Chief Blackwood didn't just commit crimes. He waged war against American veterans using the power of his office as a weapon. His actions were calculated, systematic, and designed to cause maximum psychological and economic damage to people who'd already sacrificed for their country.
Blackwood's defense attorney, a public defender who'd drawn the unenviable task of representing the disgraced police chief, could offer little in his client's defense. Your Honor, my client recognizes the severity of his actions and asks for the court's mercy. He's cooperated fully with federal investigators, and his testimony has led to the exposure of corruption networks across multiple states. Judge Hamilton wasn't impressed by the cooperation argument. Mr. Blackwood's cooperation came only after he was caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence of his crimes. The court notes that his assistance to federal investigators was motivated by self-interest, not genuine remorse. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Blackwood stood on unsteady legs and delivered what sounded like a prepared statement crafted by his attorney. Your Honor, I deeply regret my actions and the harm I caused to veteran families. I betrayed the trust placed in me as a law enforcement officer and violated my oath to serve and protect all citizens. The apology felt hollow to the veterans in the courtroom who'd experienced firsthand the cruelty and systematic nature of Blackwood's harassment. Alex watched him speak and felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness that it had taken federal intervention to stop someone who'd abused his power for so long. Judge Hamilton's sentence reflected both the severity of Blackwood's crimes and the broader message it would send to other officials who might consider similar actions. Vernon Blackwood, I hereby sentence you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are permanently banned from holding any position in law enforcement or public service. The sentence brought cheers from the veteran community in the courtroom, but Judge Hamilton wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court orders the establishment of the Veterans Protection Fund to be funded by the forfeiture of assets seized in this case. This fund will provide legal assistance to veterans facing harassment from local authorities and will serve as a lasting reminder that America does not abandon those who served. The $4.2 million in forfeited assets would indeed create a permanent legal defense fund for veterans, ensuring that future cases of harassment would be met with immediate and professional legal response. It was a fitting legacy from Blackwood's crimes, protection for the very people he'd tried to destroy. As court adjourned and Blackwood was led away in shackles, Alex felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it had taken the mobilization of hundreds of veterans, 6 Black Hawk helicopters, and a federal investigation to stop one corrupt police chief. How many other Blackwoods were operating in communities across America, protected by local politics and hidden from federal oversight? Outside the courthouse, media representatives surrounded Alex, seeking comments about the sentence and its broader implications. She'd become the face of veteran advocacy, a role she'd never sought but couldn't abandon. This case isn't just about one corrupt police chief. It's about the systemic challenges that veterans face when they try to build lives in communities that don't value their service. Chief Blackwood's sentence sends a message that America will not tolerate the harassment of people who sacrificed for this country. Tony Rivera, who had become Alex's unofficial spokesman and close friend, added his own perspective. Tank stood up to a bully when everyone else was afraid to act. Her courage exposed a network of corruption that was destroying veteran families across multiple states. The sentence is just, but the real victory is knowing that no other veteran will have to face what she endured. The Cedar Falls case had indeed changed everything. Federal legislation now protected veterans from local government harassment. Training programs educated law enforcement officers about veteran issues, and most importantly, a network of veteran advocates now existed to respond quickly when similar cases emerged.
As Alex left the courthouse that day, she carried with her the knowledge that her personal battle with Chief Blackwood had become something much larger, a national movement to protect veterans and hold corrupt officials accountable. Sometimes one person's refusal to be intimidated could change the world. Justice had been served, but the work of protecting veterans would continue long after Vernon Blackwood began serving his federal sentence.
2 years after the Blackhawks circled Cedar Falls and 200 Marines stood in formation on Main Street, Staff Sergeant Alexandra "Tank" Washington stood at the podium of the Veterans Affairs headquarters in Washington, D.C., addressing an audience of military leaders, federal officials, and veteran advocates who'd gathered to celebrate the second anniversary of the Veterans Protection Act. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as one veteran's refusal to be intimidated by a corrupt police chief had evolved into a nationwide movement that fundamentally changed how America protected its military families from local government harassment. 2 years ago, Alex began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had helped her survive 3 combat tours. I was just a veteran trying to live quietly in a small California town. I had no intention of becoming an advocate, filing lawsuits, or mobilizing the military community. All I wanted was to be treated with the same respect and fairness that any American citizen deserves. The audience included many familiar faces. Colonel Robert Iron Mike Jackson sat in the front row, now promoted to Brigadier General and serving as the Pentagon's liaison for veteran community affairs. Captain Lisa Hawk Morales, recently promoted to Major, had become the National Guard's expert on civil-military relations. Tony Bulldog Rivera had left his civilian job to become the national coordinator for veteran advocacy networks. But perhaps the most significant presence in the audience was Maria Santos, whose small diner had served as the unofficial command center during the crisis in Cedar Falls. She now ran a national nonprofit organization that provided emergency assistance to veterans facing harassment from local authorities. "Mrs. Santos," Alex said, acknowledging the older woman with a smile, "taught me something important during those dark days. She reminded me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let bullies win." Her diner became a sanctuary where veterans could find support, and her example inspired others to stand up for what's right. The Veterans Protection Act had indeed transformed the landscape for military families across America. Federal oversight now monitored local governments for patterns of discrimination against veterans. A national hotline provided immediate legal assistance to veterans facing harassment. Most importantly, rapid response teams could deploy federal resources, including military personnel in official support roles when systematic abuse was detected. The success stories were remarkable. In Texas, federal intervention had stopped a campaign of harassment against veteran-owned businesses in a town outside Fort Hood. In North Carolina, military legal advocates had exposed corrupt officials who'd been targeting Marine families near Camp Lejeune. In dozens of communities across America, the mere existence of federal oversight had deterred potential abusers from targeting veterans. But Alex's proudest achievement was the transformation of Cedar Falls itself. Under new leadership, the town had become a model for veteran-friendly communities. The corrupt officials who'd enabled Blackwood's harassment were gone, replaced by leaders who understood that military families were assets to be welcomed, not problems to be driven away. The Veterans Housing Complex on Maple Street had become the neighborhood success story, with property values rising and new families moving in regularly. David Martinez had returned from Phoenix, using federal assistance to reopen his disabled veteran business and complete his college degree. Jennifer Liu's security consulting firm was now thriving, with contracts throughout Southern California. The real victory, Alex continued her speech, wasn't putting Chief Blackwood in federal prison, though that was certainly satisfying. The real victory was proving that when veterans stand together, we can change systems that seemed impossible to challenge. The audience erupted in applause, but Alex raised her hand for quiet. She had one more important point to make. However, we cannot become complacent. The Cedar Falls case exposed systematic discrimination that was operating for nearly a decade before anyone had the resources to fight back effectively.
How many other communities have similar problems that we haven't discovered yet? How many veterans are still being harassed by corrupt officials who learned to be more careful after our case made national news? It was a sobering reminder that the work was far from over. The Veterans Protection Act and its enforcement mechanisms were powerful tools, but they required constant vigilance and ongoing commitment to be effective.
After the ceremony, Alex found herself in a quiet moment with the core group of friends who'd supported her through the crisis. Colonel Jackson, Major Morales, Tony Rivera, and Maria Santos had become more than allies. They were family, forged through shared struggle and mutual dedication to protecting veterans. Tank, Colonel Jackson said, using her call sign with the affection of someone who'd watched her grow into a national leader, I have something to tell you. The Pentagon is creating a new position, Director of Veteran Community Relations. It's a senior civilian role that would coordinate between military leadership and veteran advocacy organizations. We'd like you to consider it. Alex was touched by the offer, but she'd already made different plans. General, I'm honored, but I think I can do more good working outside the system than inside it. The advocacy networks we've built need to remain independent to be effective. Instead, Alex had accepted a position as executive director of the National Veterans Justice Alliance, a nonprofit organization that had grown out of the Cedar Falls case. The alliance provided legal representation, advocacy services, and rapid response capabilities to veterans facing harassment anywhere in America. Besides, Alex added, with a smile, someone needs to keep you Pentagon types honest when it comes to taking care of veterans after they leave active duty. As the group prepared to leave the D.C. ceremony, Tony Rivera pulled Alex aside for a private conversation. Tank, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. Do you ever regret that first traffic stop? If you'd just taken Blackwood's harassment quietly, you could have lived a peaceful life without becoming a national figure. Alex considered the question seriously. Her life had indeed changed dramatically since that evening on Highway 78 when Chief Blackwood had first targeted her for harassment. She'd gone from anonymous veteran assistance counselor to national advocate, from private citizen to public figure, from someone seeking quiet stability to someone constantly fighting for justice. Bulldog, she replied, using his old call sign, I learned something important during our deployments overseas. Sometimes you don't get to choose your battles. They choose you. When Blackwood decided to target veterans in Cedar Falls, he made the choice for all of us. The only real choice was how we'd respond. She looked around at the friends and allies who'd supported her through the crisis and continued fighting alongside her in the years that followed. I could have submitted to his harassment and lived quietly while other veterans suffered. Instead, we chose to fight back. And that choice changed everything, not just for us, but for veterans across the country. As they walked out of the Veterans Affairs building into the Washington sunshine, Alex reflected on how much had changed since that rainy night when Chief Blackwood had arrested her on fabricated charges. The corrupt police chief was serving the 4th year of his 18-year federal sentence. The harassment network he had operated had been completely dismantled. Most importantly, no other veteran would have to face what she'd endured without immediate backup from both federal authorities and military communities. The Blackhawks had returned to Camp Pendleton, the Marines had resumed their regular duties, and Cedar Falls had become a quiet town again. But the bonds forged during that crisis, the networks of veteran advocates, the federal oversight systems, the rapid response capabilities remained strong and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Alex's phone buzzed with a text message from a veteran in Ohio who was facing harassment from local officials. Within minutes, she'd connected him with legal advocates, federal investigators, and local veteran networks that could provide immediate support. It was exactly the kind of rapid response that hadn't existed before the Cedar Falls case. See, she told Tony Rivera, showing him the message, this is why we do this work. Every veteran who doesn't have to face harassment alone, every corrupt official who thinks twice before targeting military families, every community that welcomes veterans instead of driving them away, that's our victory. As Alex Washington headed back to California to continue her work protecting veterans, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes
One person's courage to stand up to a bully can change the entire world. The 6 Blackhawks and 200 Marines had made their statement, but the real power lay in the ongoing commitment to ensure that America's veterans would never again face systematic harassment without overwhelming support from their military family. The ghost of Vernon Blackwood's corruption had been laid to rest, but the spirit of veteran solidarity that had defeated him would endure forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.